Alma Teague caught near every child born on the Barcross Range for 32 years. 400 souls, give or take, pulled into the cold Wyoming morning by these two hands. And on a spring day, when she was 61 years old, 4 men carried her rocking chair out of the ranch house she'd birthed 3 generations in, and set it down in the mud by the lean-to. She did not weep. She folded her hands in her lap, and she watched. The man who ordered it was Garrett Halloran. He was 40 that year, and he was riding high. He docked the $6 a month in keep that old Ephraim had sworn to her for life, sworn on his own hearth, and Garrett told her so before the whole spring branding. 60 men within earshot. Steam coming off the irons. He looked down at her from his good horse, and he said, "Plain as weather. We don't feed granny women for stories nobody needs anymore." 60 men heard it. Not one of them knew what she was carrying. Because Ephraim left me a letter the winter he died, pressed it into my hand with his own fingers gone thin as kindling, and made me swear not to open it till his true blood had need of it. I put it in the flour tin, behind the lard, and I near forgot it was there. But that fall, riding home from the Roundup grounds with the light going gold across the sage, I finally cut the wax. If you've ever been treated as invisible by the very family you gave your whole life to, if you've ever poured out your years for people who stepped over you like a stone in the road the day you couldn't work no more, then sit close. This story is for you. Before I go on, do an old woman a kindness. Subscribe to this channel, and down in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. Just the name of it. I want to see how far across this country an old woman's word can travel. Because a word carried far enough can undo a man who thought no one was listening. Now, let me tell it the way it happened. I'll start where the trouble started, which is a long way back before the trouble. My name is Alma Teague, and I was the midwife on the Barcross Range from the time I was a young widow of 29. My husband Tom took a fever the second winter we were married, and he went into the ground before the thaw. We had no children. We had a claim that dried up and blew away. And I had these hands, and a gift my own mother gave me, which was the knowing of how to bring a baby safe into the world when the world would just as soon take both mother and child. Ephraim Halloran found me nursing a neighbor woman through a hard birth in a soddy near the Rulison road. He was a big man then, black-bearded, loud as a bull, and he had a wife carrying his first hope. He said, "You'll come stay at the Barcross, and you'll catch mine, and I'll never see you go without." I was near starving. I went. And Delia Halloran's first came into the world in my arms that April. That child died at 3 days. So did the next. Delia was a slight woman, and something in her didn't hold. I sat up with her through nights that had no bottom to them. I washed the little ones and wrapped them, and helped dig where the family plot sat under the cottonwood. Ephraim would come stand over those small graves with his hat in his hands, and he never said a word to me but stay. Just that. Stay, so I stayed. I had my room off the kitchen, warm from the cook stove all winter. I had my chair by the window. And in time, I wasn't only the Barcross midwife. I was every soddy and dugout and tar paper cabin in the whole of Rulison County. If a woman's time came in a February blizzard, they sent a rider for Alma, and I went. I went in wagons and on borrowed mules and once on foot through snow to my knees. I caught the bankers' twins in Rulison town. I caught the Vega children out past the breaks. I caught Hans babies and homesteaders' babies and the sheriff's own grandson, 32 years. Near 400. You come to know a family in a way no one else does when you're the one waiting in the dark for their children. You know who was afraid and who was brave. You know whose baby came early, and you can count the months on your fingers, though you never say a thing. A midwife is a keeper of secrets whether she wants to be or not. Most of mine I carried straight to where they'd be buried with me. That was the trade. That was the trust. And there was one secret bigger than the rest. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I told you I'd go slow. Ephraim's wife, Delia, finally carried one to term. A boy. Big and squalling and pink, and Ephraim wept over that cradle like the drought had broke at last. He named the boy Garrett. He raised him up as the heir to everything: the house, the herd, the Bar Cross brand burned into 11,000 acres of the best grass in the territory. Garrett grew tall and hard-handed and quick to anger, and Ephraim couldn't see a fault in him. A man who's buried that many hopes will love the one that lives past all reason. I helped raise that boy, rocked him in the very chair they hauled out to the mud, doctored his fevers. And I'll tell you now what I knew then, and said to no living soul. But I'll make you wait for it, the way I had to wait, because that's the shape of the thing. The winter, before Ephraim passed, he was failing, and he knew it. His lungs had filled, and his big frame had gone to sticks under the quilts. He sent the housekeeper out one evening and had me come sit by his bed alone. He took a folded letter from under his pillow, sealed thick with red wax and pressed with his own thumb ring. He put it in my hand and closed my fingers over it with both of his. "Alma," he said, and his voice was near gone. "You've kept more of my secrets than my own priest. Keep this one last. Don't you open it till my true blood has need. You'll know the hour. You'll know the boy. Swear it to me." I swore. I didn't rightly know what he meant, and I was too grieved to press him. And by morning his fever was up, and he never spoke plain again. He died on the 2nd of December, with the wind screaming down off the divide. I took that letter home to my room, and I put it in the flour tin behind the lard, and I told myself I'd think on it when the grief eased. Then the grief didn't ease, and the letter sat, and I near forgot it was there at all. That was my mistake, and I'll own it. I let the most important thing Ephraim ever gave me sit in a flour tin gathering dust, because I'd got it into my head that an old woman's word wasn't worth the paper it sat on. You hold that thought. It near cost everything. Now, Ephraim wasn't 3 weeks in the ground before Garrett Halloran showed me what kind of country I was living in. It came quiet, the first blow. That's how it usually does. Garrett didn't say a word to my face. He said it to the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, a good woman who couldn't meet my eyes when she brought it to me. He'd stopped my keep. The $6 a month Ephraim swore me for life, gone, like turning off a spigot. And I was to be moved out of my room off the kitchen. Out of the house entire. There was a lean-to shed at the edge of Rulison town that the Bar Cross used to store harness in, and that was to be mine now. Mrs. Pruitt stood in my doorway wringing her apron. He says. She stopped. He says to see the old woman doesn't wander back up to the house. Doesn't wander back up. Like I was a stray dog that might come nosing at the door for scraps. 32 years I'd walked in and out of that house at every hour God made, and now I was to be watched off the porch. I didn't fight it. What was there to fight with? I packed what was mine, which fit in a carpet bag and a wooden box. My mother's Bible. My birthing tools, clean and rolled in oilcloth. The flour tin, with the letter still inside, I brought it out of habit. Not out of any grand plan, and thank God I did. I walked down to the harness shed at the edge of town, and I swept out the mouse dirt, and I hung a blanket for a door, and I made it a home the way you learn to make anything a home when you've had nothing before. Only Mrs. Pruitt saw me go. She cried. I didn't. I'd learned a long time back that tears are a thing you spend, and I was saving mine. You'd think a man who'd cast an old woman out of his father's house would let it rest there. He'd won. There was nothing left of me to take. But there's a kind of man who can't leave a thing be while it still stands up straight. And Garrett was that kind. It wasn't enough that I was gone. He had to grind it under his heel where folks could see. There was a hired hand named Pete Loomis, a young fellow, not cruel but weak, the sort that laughs when the boss laughs. Garrett had him, and another hand, load up my rocking chair. The chair from my old room. The very chair I'd rocked Garrett himself in when he was a colicky babe screaming half the night, and haul it out to the yard. I heard the wagon and came to the mouth of the shed to see what was wanted, and I watched them stand my chair up in the dirt. Garrett came out onto the porch with a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. He looked at the chair, and he looked at me down the length of the road, and he said it loud enough to carry. "We don't keep what we don't use." Then Pete Loomis, God forgive him, took an axe to it, broke it down to kindling right there in the yard, the joints Tom, my husband, had pegged with his own hands 40 years before, and they threw the pieces on the cook fire and burned my chair to warm their supper. I stood in the door of my shed and I watched the smoke of it go up. And I want you to hear me. I did not weep. I folded my hands, but something in me changed shape that afternoon. The way iron changes when you leave it in the coals. It don't look different right off. But it's harder than it was. 2 blows a man could hide. If he was smart. A private eviction. A chair burned before one weak-minded hand. Garrett could have told himself it never happened, and made the world tell him the same, but arrogance is a disease that always wants a bigger stage, and the spring branding gave him one. The branding was the biggest gather of the year, save the fall roundup. Every hand on the bar cross, and neighbors come to help and be helped, and buyers, and the brand inspector, and half of Rulison town, 60 men, easy. Maybe more, standing in the smoke, and the bawling, and the smell of scorched hair. I'll tell you why I went into that crowd, because you'll want to know I didn't go looking to be shamed. I went for the pension, not charity. A promise. Years before, at that same branding ground, in front of that same kind of crowd, Ephraim Halloran had stood up on a wagon tongue after a good season and made a speech the way big men do when they're proud and full of beef. And he'd pointed me out where I stood at the edge, and he'd said, "There's the woman that's caught every one of your babies. When she's too old to ride to a birth, this outfit keeps her till she dies, and any man that says different can draw his time." 50 men heard him say it. Some of them were standing in that same yard the day I came to hold Garrett to it. So I walked up to the branding, an old woman in her good dark dress, and I waited for a lull, and I called out to Garrett across the fire that I'd come to ask about the keep his father promised me before witnesses. I said it plain, and I said it steady. I only wanted what was sworn. The whole yard went quiet. Even the irons seemed to stop. Garrett let it hang. He was good at that. Then he laughed, and he made sure it was a big laugh, so every man would know it was safe to laugh with him. "Keep," he said. "For what? For a half-blind granny woman's stories?" My father was soft in the head at the end, and every leech in the county came to suck on him. He turned to the crowd, arms wide, playing to them. "She'll tell you she caught the lot of you. She'll tell you the moon's made of cheese if there's a meal in it. We don't feed granny women for stories nobody needs anymore." Some men laughed. Most looked at their boots. I saw a few faces go tight and turn away, and I marked those, because a woman remembers who couldn't stomach it. But the laughing was enough. The thing was done, out loud, in front of the county. And here's what Garrett Halloran, in all his cleverness, never once understood. He thought he'd closed an account. He'd opened one. Every man in that yard was now a witness, not just to my shaming, but to the promise he was breaking. 60 men who'd carry the memory of it home to 60 suppers. You cannot unring a bell you rang before the whole county. He'd taken a private cruelty and made it public record, and one day the whole county would be standing in a yard just like that one, and I'd need them to remember. They would. I said nothing back to him. I looked at him a long moment, and then I turned and walked home to my shed, and behind me the branding took up again, the irons and the bawling and the low talk of men who'd seen a thing they didn't like and didn't know how to stop. Let them carry it. I could wait. I'd got very, very good at waiting. Then came the winter, and the winter was the hardest thing. You don't know cold till you've spent it old and alone in a harness shed at the edge of a Wyoming town. The wind came through the boards like it had a grudge. I had a little sheet iron stove and never enough wood, and some mornings the water in my bucket wore a skin of ice by the door. I did washing for town families to earn a few coins, and I set bones and dosed fevers for folks too poor to fetch the Rulison doctor, and I got by. Barely. Some nights I lay under every quilt I owned and listened to my own breath and thought, Alma, you have outlived your use, and the world has told you so out loud, and maybe the world is right. That's the blind spot, and I'll confess it to you, the way I've made peace with it now. I believed them. Down in the dark part of me, where a body keeps the truth it's ashamed of, I'd started to believe that my word was worth nothing, that a cast-off granny woman couldn't move a straw, let alone a man like Garrett Halloran. That letter in the flour tin might as well have been blank paper, for all the good I thought an old woman could do with it. I very near let it rot there, but the Lord doesn't leave you all the way alone, even at the bottom of a Wyoming winter. He sent me Wade. Wade Cobb was a fence rider on the bar cross, a quiet young man of 27, raised up under a hired hand's name with no family anyone spoke of. He was the sort of man other men overlook, never loud, never first at the table, good with a horse and gentle with a stray. I'd known him since he was a boy, though I'd never told him, never told anyone, the thing I knew about him. He started coming by my shed that first hard winter with an armload of firewood off the Barcross woodlot. He never made a show of it. He'd just stack it by my door and stamp the snow off his boots and sit a while and tell me the news of the range. And sometimes eat a bowl of whatever I had on the stove and say it was the best he'd had, which was a lie, and a kind one. You don't have to do this, Wade, I told him once. Garrett catches you giving Barcross wood to me, he'll dock you. Wade just fed a stick into my stove and said, reckon he can dock me then. A body that catches every baby on the range oughtn't freeze in a shed. And he wouldn't hear another word on it. I looked at that young man in my firelight, and I thought about the letter in the flour tin, not 4 feet from where he sat, and my heart near came up out of my chest. But I'd sworn an oath. Not till his true blood has need. It wasn't the hour. Not yet. So I kept my mouth shut and my hands still, and I let him think he was just being kind to a poor old woman. Which he was. But he was more than that, and he didn't know it, and neither did the man who'd cast me out. Wade brought me the news too, and it was the news that finally moved me. He came one gray afternoon near the end of winter looking troubled, and it took him a while to say it. Garrett had made a deal. There was an outfit out of the east, the Kettleman Land and Cattle Syndicate, buying up range all across the territory. Big money, bankers' money. And Garrett had struck a bargain to sell them the whole of the Barcross. Herd, range lease, the brand, all of it. $22,000, Wade had heard, and the papers were to be signed at the close of the fall roundup, when the herd was gathered and counted and the count could be handed over clean. 7 days from the first gather to the buyer's pen. I sat very still while Wade told me. He thought I was grieved for the Barcross, and I was. But it was more than grief moving in me. Because I understood, all at once, what Garrett was doing. He was in a hurry. A man doesn't sell his father's land and his father's brand and his father's grass, everything that made him somebody. A man doesn't sell all that off to strangers unless he's got a reason to get it turned into money and gone before anybody looks too hard at how he came by it. Garrett was cashing out and clearing out. And once that brand passed to the syndicate and Garrett rode off with his $22,000, it would be too late. The truth Ephraim gave me to keep would have nothing left to stand on. Whatever I was going to do, I had until the close of the fall roundup to do it. After that, the Barcross would pass out of Halloran hands forever, and no letter, no oath, no old woman's word would ever call it back. I didn't touch the flour tin that night. I'll be honest with you. I lay awake, and I thought, Alma, You're 61 years old, and you live in a shed. And that man has 60,000 acres and the whole weight of the world on his side. And what do you have? A sealed letter you're afraid to open, and a young man's kindness you're afraid to spend. Leave it be. Let them sell. It's not your fight. You did your years. Go quiet. I almost listened. God help me, I almost did. The fall came on. The aspens on the divide went to gold and then to bare gray sticks, and the cook camp went out to the Roundup grounds, and the whole range turned to the business of gathering 10,000 head of cattle down off the high country. I still did small kindnesses where I could, and one of them was carrying eggs. There was a widow near me kept hens, and she was poorly, and I'd take her eggs out to sell to the Roundup cook camp, where a man will pay good money for a fresh egg after a month of beans and bacon. It was a fair walk, out and back, but I was glad of the work and glad of the coins. It was on the road home from the cook camp, with my empty basket on my arm and the light going long and gold across the sage, that I finally did the thing I'd been afraid of for near a year. I don't rightly know what turned me. Maybe it was the smell of the cattle and the sound of the men whooping far off, the whole Roundup pulling together for the last time under the Barcross brand before Garrett signed it away to strangers. Maybe it was just that I was tired of being afraid. I stopped in the road. I set down my basket. And I thought about Ephraim's two big hands closing my fingers over that letter. You'll know the hour. You'll know the boy. And I thought, Alma, if not now. When? When the brand's gone and the boy's grown old under another man's name and never knew? Is that the faith you swore? Is that worth an oath? I turned around. I didn't go home to my shed to fetch it, because the truth is I'd taken to carrying that letter on my own person by then, sewn flat inside my dress against my ribs. Ever since the news of the sale, some animal part of me knew, before my head did, that a thing that precious oughtn't be left in a tin where a man could send someone to find it. I stepped off the road into the shelter of a coulee, out of the wind, and I sat down on a flat rock, and I took the letter out against my heart, and with my thumbnail I cut the wax that Ephraim Halloran had pressed with his own ring the winter before he died. The paper crackled like it had been waiting to speak. His hand was shaky, but it was his. I'd have known it anywhere. The same hand that signed off my keep at the bottom of a ledger for 32 years. I read it in the gold light, with the wind moving the sage, and I read it 3 times, and when I was done my hands were not steady at all. I won't give you every word yet, but I'll give you the heart of it, because you've waited as patiently as I did, and you've earned it. Ephraim confessed the whole of it, the thing I'd known and buried these many years. He'd known too, and it had eaten at him to his last breath. Garrett, the boy he'd raised as his heir, the boy who'd burned my chair and shamed me before the county, Garrett was not his son. Not by blood, not by any drop. His wife Delia, God rest her troubled soul, had got that boy off the foreman. Dolan slowed in a year when Ephraim was much away, and Ephraim had learned it too late to do anything but hold his peace and raise the child, because a proud man cannot bear to have the county know his heir is another man's get. But that wasn't the whole of the letter. That was only the wound. The rest was the healing. Ephraim wrote that he did have a son, a true-born son, of his own blood, and I knew it, because I had caught that child myself one night years back, out past the breaks, a beautiful boy born to a woman named Marisol Vega, whom Ephraim had loved in his lonesome middle years more than he ever loved anyone, and who died of the birthing before the sun came up. To keep the peace, to keep Delia from shame and the county from talk, that boy had been given out quiet to be raised under a hired hand's name, given the name Cobb, and Ephraim's letter named him, named his true and only blood, and swore before God and by his own hand that the Barcross, all of it, the house and the herd and the brand and every acre, was left to his blood, whom Alma Teague can name and mark. because I was the only living soul who'd been in both rooms. I caught the false heir, and I caught the true one. I knew which cradle held Ephraim's blood, and I could prove it. For the true-born boy carried the mark every Halloran carried, the crooked thumb, the Halloran thumb, bent at the joint like a bit of fence wire, plain as a brand on the hand of every one of them going back 3 generations. Garrett's thumbs were straight as a schoolteacher's. But Wade Cobb's right thumb had a crook in it I'd seen 100 times, hooked around a coffee cup in my own firelight, and never once let myself look at straight on. Because to look at it was to know, and to know was to owe Ephraim the thing I'd been too afraid to pay. I sat on that rock in the coulee till the gold light went to gray and the cold came up out of the ground, and I did not feel the cold at all. Because I understood, at last, the whole shape of the thing I was sitting inside of. The quiet fence rider who brought me firewood so I wouldn't freeze. The gentle young man who ate my thin soup and called it fine. The one man on all that range who'd shown an old cast-off woman a scrap of kindness, he was the true heir to everything the man who cast me out was about to sell to strangers. Wade was Ephraim's blood. Wade was the bar cross. And he didn't know it, and never would, unless one frightened old woman found her nerve at last and stood up before the same 60 men who'd laughed at her, and said it out loud. And I had until the close of the Roundup. 7 days, or near it. After that the brand was gone, and the truth was worth nothing. I folded that letter back against my ribs, and I stood up off the rock, and I want to tell you something happened in me right there in the dark that I don't have a fine word for. The iron that had been heating in the coals since the day they burned my chair, it came out on the anvil at last. All that year I'd believed the thing they told me, that my word was worthless, that an old woman couldn't move a straw. Standing in that coulee with Ephraim's confession against my heart, I quit believing it. I had the one word in all the territory that Garrett Halloran couldn't buy and couldn't burn and couldn't laugh away. I had the truth, and I had a place to say it. The fall Roundup. Before the county, before the brand inspector, before the very buyer with his $22,000 and his pen, the same eyes that watched me shamed would watch me speak. I picked up my empty egg basket, and I started walking home in the dark, and for the first time in a long, long while, I was not afraid. I was decided. That's a different thing, and it's a stronger one. But deciding is easy in a coulee at dusk with no one to stop you. A letter is only paper, and paper can be taken, and a man who'd burn an old woman's chair to warm his supper would not stop at a letter if he ever learned it existed. I had the truth. What I did not yet have was any way to make it stand up that Garrett couldn't knock down, no witness the county would credit over a rich man, no paper filed where he couldn't reach it, no proof but my own aging word and a crook in a young man's thumb that Garrett would call a lie the moment I spoke it. And somewhere out on that dark range, closer than I knew, Garrett Halloran had already caught the first whisper that the old granny woman he'd thrown away had been seen where she had no business being, and had started to wonder, for the first time, whether he'd buried her deep enough. The courthouse in Rulison sat at the end of the one long street, brick and square, with a flag that hung dead in the still fall air. I had not been inside it since Tom and I filed our marriage lines, 40 years before. I walked up the steps slow. My knees are not what they were. But I went in. The clerk was a young man named Ferris, thin, with ink on his fingers and spectacles pushed up on his nose. He did not know me. That was fine. I did not want to be known that day. I wanted to be an old woman asking a plain question, the kind a clerk answers and forgets by supper. I asked him about Ephraim Halloran's will. He went back into the shelves and came out with a great bound book, and he laid it open on the counter between us. I could not read all the lawyer's words, but Ferris read them for me, in the flat voice young men use for things that mean nothing to them. And there it was. Ephraim had left the bar cross, the land and the herd and the brand, to the son of my body, whom Alma Teague can name and mark. The son of my body, not the son of my name. Ephraim had chosen his words the way he chose a horse, careful, for the long road. And he had put my name in the paper of the law. Alma Teague can name and mark. He had reached down out of the ground and handed me the whole thing. I asked Ferris if there was aught else. A paper filed close to that one. He turned the pages, and he found it. A codicil, he called it, a small paper added to the big one, filed by Ephraim's own hand in the last winter of his life. It named the son Alma Teague shall identify before witnesses. Same words, near enough. Filed, stamped, kept, I stood at that counter, and I understood what Ephraim had done. Garrett had the house copy. Garrett had likely burned it or locked it in his desk, the way he'd burned my chair, thinking the fire ended it. But Ephraim, who knew his own household better than Garrett ever guessed, had walked to town in the cold and filed a second copy where Garrett's hands could not reach. A copy in the county's own book. A truth that did not live only on my person, that could not be taken off me in the night. I asked Ferris for a plain copy I could carry. He wrote one out, careful, and stamped it, and I paid him from the egg money, and I folded it small. Then I walked back out into the light, and I stood on the steps a while, and I let my heart come down slow. The letter against my ribs was still the letter. But now it was not alone. That was the first stone laid under my house. There was one thing more I needed, and it was the hardest, because it was a lie of a kind, and I have never been easy with lies, even small ones in a good cause. Wade Cobb came by my lean to most every third day that fall with an armload of wood. He never made much of it. He'd stack it against the wall, and take his coffee if I had it, and tell me the small news of the range, who was hurt and whose mare had foaled. He did not know I watched his hands the whole time. I had wrapped those hands the night he was born. I knew what I was looking for. But a woman must be sure. So one evening I asked him, plain as I could make it, to help me open a stuck jar. The lid had never been stuck. I had loosed it myself and set it back light. He took it up in his right hand and gave it a turn, and there in the lamplight I saw the thumb. The crooked Halloran thumb, bent in at the last knuckle, the way Ephraim's had been, the way Ephraim's father's had been before him, so they said. It turns a little to the side, like it's pointing at something only it can see. I had caught that thumb on 3 generations of Hallorans. It had never once been on Garrett. It was on this fence rider's hand, plain as the mark on a heifer. There you are, I said, and I took the jar back, and my voice did not shake, though everything under it did. He asked if I was well. I said I was fine, only tired, and he ought to get on before dark. He went. I sat down on the crate that served me for a chair, and I put my hands over my face, and I thanked God and Ephraim both. The proof was not on paper alone. It was in the record at the courthouse, and it was in the boy's own body, carried on his hand every day of his life, and neither one could be stolen in the night. That was the second stone. And I slept that night better than I had since they set my chair in the mud. But a man like Garrett does not sleep when he starts to wonder. The whisper had reached him, the way whispers do. Somebody had seen the old granny woman going up the courthouse steps. Somebody had said it to somebody who said it to him. And a man with a guilty house cannot hear that an old woman went to the courthouse without his skin going cold. He sent Dolan slowed. I was down at the well the afternoon it happened, hauling water, slow, a bucket at a time. When I came back up the path, I saw the door of my lean to standing open, and I knew. I set the bucket down, and I went quiet to the window and looked in, and there was Slode, the foreman, Garrett's own true father, though the man hardly knew it, down on his knees going through my things. He had the flour tin out. He had his hand in it, feeling past the lard for whatever a man hides in a flour tin. He had my birthing tools unrolled from the oilcloth. He had my mother's Bible open and shaken by the spine, the way you shake a book to see what falls out. He was looking for the letter. Somebody had guessed there was a letter. He found nothing, because the letter was not in the flour tin anymore, and had not been for weeks. It was sewn flat inside my dress, against my ribs, where it had ridden every hour of every day since the coulee. I stood at my own window and watched a grown man tear my poor few things apart, hunting for a thing that was lying against my heart the whole time, close enough that if he'd embraced me, he'd have felt the crackle of it. And I will tell you the truth. I nearly laughed. It was not a kind laugh, but it rose in me all the same. He came out empty. He saw me standing there by the well. He had the grace, at least, to look away. "Garrett wants to see you," he said. I went. There was no use not going. I walked up to the big house I'd lived in 32 years and was now forbidden, and Mrs. Pruitt let me in with her mouth pinched tight, and I stood in Ephraim's own study while Garrett sat behind Ephraim's own desk like he'd been poured into the chair. He tried money first. That is always how they try it, the ones who've never wanted for it. He counted out $200 on the green blotter, slow, so I'd watch each bill land. More money than I'd seen at once in my whole life. $200, and a ticket on the stage, he said, all the way to my sister's in Nebraska, if I'd only go before the Roundup and not trouble him with any more of my wandering. "You've had a hard turn, Alma," he said, gentle as poison. "Ephraim's gone, and things have changed, and there's no place for you here anymore. Take the money, go be with your people. Let an old woman rest." I looked at the money a good while. I want you to know I looked at it honest. $200 and a warm room at my sister's, and no more hauling water at 61 years old. It was a real thing he was offering, and part of me, the tired part, the cold part, wanted it bad. Then I looked at his hands on the desk. And I thought of the thumb they didn't have. And I thought of Ephraim in the cold walking to town to file a paper so that this exact hour would not be the end of it. "I've got no wandering left in me, Garrett," I said. "I'm too old to go anywhere. I'll stay in my lean-to and mind my own, and you'll not hear from me." I did not take the money, but I did not throw it in his face either. I let him think the tiredness had won. I let him think I was beaten and only wanted to be left to die quiet. That was the only lie I told him, and I told it with my face and not my mouth, and God can weigh it against the rest of my life however he likes. He let me go. He thought he'd buried me deep enough after all. And all the way back down the hill I walked slow and bent, an old woman with nothing, and I kept it up till I was past the last window, and then I straightened, and I walked the rest of the way like what I was. Decided, the county rode in for the Roundup the way it does every fall, and the whole valley came alive with it. Dust and bawling cattle, and the smell of the branding fire and coffee boiled black in pots the size of washtubs. 60 men and more. Neighbors from 3 days' ride. The brand inspector, a square man named Halstead with a ledger he kept open on a barrel. And the syndicate man, the kettleman buyer, in his town coat and his clean boots, with a leather case and a pen. Come to take the bar cross away for $22,000 at the close of the tally. I meant to be there, and the night before, Garrett made sure I would not be. Slode came again in the dark. This time he did not search. This time he knew where to look, because by then Garrett had put it together that the letter was on my person, or near it, and that there was a daybook too, where I'd set down my births across the years, every child, every date, every mother. Slode did not come alone, and he did not come polite. He came while I slept, and he took the daybook off the shelf, and worse, he found where I'd unpicked the seam to air the letter that one evening and left it under the Bible. He took them both, the letter and the daybook. By the time I woke he was gone, and my proof was gone with him. And in the morning, Garrett had 2 riders at the Roundup gate with orders to turn me back. "Old woman's a trespasser," he told them. "Ranch business is closed to her. She's got no place on Bar Cross ground." So there I stood at the gate in the cold morning with nothing. No letter, no daybook, barred from the very ground I meant to speak on. All my stones knocked out from under me in a single night, or so it looked, and the sale not 4 hours off. I will not pretend I did not feel it. I felt the year of it come down on me at that gate all at once, the chair and the fire and the 60 men and $200. Go be with your people. And now, this. I stood there and I shook, but I had 2 stones left that Slode's hands could not reach. One was filed in the county's book in town, and I had sent a neighbor boy off before dawn to fetch it, before I even knew the letter was gone, on a feeling I could not have named. And the other stone was walking toward me down the fence line with an armload of nothing and a puzzled look, because he'd heard the old woman was turned back at the gate and could not understand it. Wade Cobb. I had never told him. All that fall I had kept it off him, because it was not a thing to lay on a manlight, and because I needed him not to act different around Garrett before the day. But the day was here. And I took Wade Cobb aside by the fence, out of the rider's hearing, and I told him, not all of it. Enough, I told him whose son he was. I told him about Marisol Vega, the woman who bore him past the brakes and died doing it, and how I wrapped him in indigo and gave him out under the Cobb name to keep the peace in a house that had none. I told him about the thumb on his own right hand. I told him Ephraim left the bar cross to his blood, and that his blood was standing in front of me in a fence rider's coat. He did not believe me. Of course he did not. His blind spot was that he could not imagine he was anyone. He looked at me like I'd taken a fever. "Alma," he said, "I'm a hired hand. My daddy was a hired hand." And I said, "Your daddy was Ephraim Halloran, and I caught you the night you were born. And I have never in my life been wrong about a thing I caught with my own 2 hands." Then I asked him the only thing I needed. I asked him to ride me through that gate, not to believe me, just to ride me in. A hand on his own horse, and no rider under Garrett's orders was going to lay hands on Wade Cobb to stop an old woman he'd carried firewood to all winter. He looked at the gate. He looked at me. And whatever he did or didn't believe, he was a decent man, and a decent man does not leave an old woman shaking at a gate. He put me up behind him on his horse, and he rode me through, past the 2 riders, who looked at each other and did not quite dare, and in among the 60 men, and the branding fire, and the barrel with the inspector's ledger, and the town man with his pen, and he set me down by the tally fire in the middle of them all. And I stood up in front of the same eyes that had watched me shamed in the spring. And I told it. I did not raise my voice. I have never had to. A midwife learns young that the quiet voice is the one they lean in to hear. The fire snapped, and the cattle bawled off in the pens, and I stood there small and gray in that ring of tall men, and I began. I told them who I was, though they knew. 32 years. Near 400 children caught on this range. I told them I had caught Halloran babies for 3 generations. Then I told them there was one Halloran I never caught. And I turned, and I looked at Garrett across the fire. He came off his feet fast. "This is the granny woman I warned you about," he said to the men. Loud, laughing that laugh. Half blind and full of stories. Somebody take her off my ground. Nobody moved. That was the first thing. In the spring, 60 men had laughed with him. Now 60 men stood still and watched, because a year is a long time to watch a rich man burn an old woman's chair, and men remember more than they let on. "You're right that I've got a story, Garrett," I said. "But I'm not going to ask you to believe an old woman's word. I know better than that. So I'll ask the county's own book instead." And I called out, across the fire, for the boy I'd sent to town. He came pushing through the men with the clerk's paper in his fist, the copy stamped with Rulison County's own seal, and it went from his hand to the inspector's hand, to Halstead, the square man, who read it slow with the whole camp gone quiet around him. "To the son of my body, Halstead read out, "Whom Alma Teague can name and mark." He looked up. "That's Ephraim Halloran's hand. That's the county seal. Filed the winter before he died." The syndicate man had stopped writing. I saw him set his pen down on the barrel. Careful, the way you set down a thing that has turned hot. Garrett's face had gone a color I'd never seen on it. "That paper means nothing," he said. "I'm his son. Everybody here knows I'm his son." "Then it costs you nothing to prove it," I said. And now I let my voice come up, just a little, just enough to carry to the last man at the back. Ephraim Halloran carried the Halloran thumb. So did his father. Crooked at the knuckle, bent to the side. Every true Halloran that ever drew breath carried it. I've caught 3 generations of them, and I never once caught one without it. I turned to the inspector. Ask him to show his right hand. The whole camp turned to Garrett. You could feel it move, 60 men turning at once. Garrett put his hand in his coat. He did not mean to. It was the body doing what the mind was too proud to. His right hand went into his coat and stayed there, curled shut against him, hidden, and every man at that fire saw him do it, and every man understood it, and not one word had to be said. A hidden hand tells its own story. "Show them, Garrett," I said, quiet again. "Show them the thumb. That's all. Show them, and I'll walk off this ground and never trouble you again." He could not. His hand stayed in his coat, and the longer it stayed, the louder the thing got, till the silence was worse than any shout. Then I turned to Wade. He had stood back from all of it, at the edge of the firelight, still not believing, still a hired hand in his own mind. But he was watching now. They all were. "Wade," I said, "open your hand." He looked at me. He looked at the ring of faces. And slow, like a man in a dream, he brought his right hand up into the firelight, and he opened it. And there it was, the crooked Halloran thumb, bent at the knuckle, turned to the side, plain as Ephraim's had ever been, plain as a brand. The inspector saw it. The buyer saw it. 60 men saw it. The 2 hands they matched against each other in their minds, Garrett's hidden and Wade's open, and the thing settled over that whole camp like snow coming down. I let it sit. Then I said the thing I'd come to say, the thing that had been building in me since the morning they set my chair in the mud. "I've caught near every soul on this range for 32 years, Garrett. I know which cradle held Ephraim's blood. And God is my witness, it never once was yours." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The fire snapped. There was one thing more. And it was for Wade, not for Garrett. I reached into the bundle I'd brought, and I drew out the shawl. Indigo, dyed dark, with the bar cross worked into the corner in white thread, small stitches, an old woman's winter work from 27 years back. I had kept it all that time. It was the mate to the one I'd wrapped him in the night he was born. Both cut from the same bolt, both stitched by the same hand. "You've had the other one your whole life and never knew it," I said to Wade. "You've been throwing your saddle over it." And his face changed then, because he did know it. That old blue saddlecloth he'd carried for years, worn soft, the pattern near rubbed out of one corner. He'd never asked where it came from. It had just always been his, the way the thumb had always been his, the way his whole self had always been Ephraim's, and he the last to know it. He looked at the shawl in my hands, and he looked at the one on his own saddle by the fence, and the white thread matched, corner for corner, bar cross for bar cross. That was when he believed it. Not the paper, and not the thumb. The shawl. A man will argue with a document. He cannot argue with the blanket his mother wrapped him in. Now I will tell you what each of them did, because it is only right that each face gets its own account, the way each of them earned it. Garrett went to bluster one last time. He came around the fire at me with his color high, saying it was a plot, saying I'd stitched that shawl myself last week, saying the thumb was a common thing. Half the county had a crooked thumb. But his voice had no floor under it anymore. The men had already turned. He heard himself talking into a silence that had made up its mind, and he ran down like a clock and stopped. And then he did the thing that finished him. He looked at the inspector and at the buyer, and he saw that the money was gone. The whole $22,000 of it walking off with a capped pen, and something in his face just closed. He had never in his life been told no by this valley. He got told no by all of it at once. His hand was still in his coat. Dolan Slode stepped back from the fire. I watched him do it. He'd been standing near Garrett the whole time, foreman at his master's shoulder, and as the thing came clear, as the county understood that the man they'd called Halloran carried no Halloran blood, Slode understood the rest of it, the part only he and Delia and the grave had known. That the blood in Garrett was his own. That he was watching his own son shamed at a tally fire, and could not say a word to own him without hanging himself in the same breath. He stepped back out of the light. His face came apart quiet, the way a bank cuts under a river, no sound, just gone. He did not run. He just backed out of the ring and stood in the dark at the edge of the pens, an old man undone by a thing he'd kept 40 years, and nobody went after him, because nobody yet knew what I knew, and I did not tell that part. Some truths are the county's business. That one was God's. I let it lie. The syndicate man capped his pen. He was a careful fellow, and careful fellows do not buy a ranch whose brand is in dispute. He'd heard enough. He put his pen in his coat, and he closed his leather case, and he said, to nobody in particular, but to all of us, that the Kettleman Land and Cattle Syndicate could not proceed to purchase where clear title had not been established, and that the matter would want settling in the courts before any offer stood. Which is a town man's long way of saying he wanted no part of it. $22,000 folded itself back up and rode away in a leather case. The bar cross did not sell that day. It has not sold to this one. And the neighbors turned to Wade. That was the last thing, and the best. One by one, the way men do when they've been shown the truth and are ashamed they didn't see it sooner, they turned from Garrett and they faced the fence rider. Old Halstead, the inspector, came over and looked at the thumb up close and looked at the paper again and nodded. Slow. A man entering a thing in a ledger that would stand. And one of the old hands, a fellow who'd known Ephraim 30 years, took off his hat to Wade Cobb, who was not Cobb anymore and never had been, and said, well, you've got his look. I don't know why I never saw it. And Wade stood there in the firelight with the shawl in his hands and the whole valley turning toward him, and he had the same expression I'd put on his face the night he was born, which is the face of a soul that has just arrived somewhere and does not yet know the country. That was the Roundup where I told it. That was the fall the bar cross came home. Now let me tell you the end, because a story ought to be walked all the way to the door and not left standing in the yard. It is a year on from that fire. I am telling you this from my own room off the kitchen, the one they moved me out of, the one Wade moved me back into the first week, before he'd even sorted the deed. There is a rocking chair by my window. It is not the old one. The old one is ash and gone. Wade made this one himself over the winter, in the evenings, in the shop, and he made it to match the burned one as near as he could remember, which was near enough to make me weep the day he carried it in. It has the same high back and the same worn place he could not have known about, because he built it new, and yet somehow his hands found the same curve. Blood does that, I think. Blood remembers a shape. The herd is out on the fall grass, unsold, 10,000 head give or take, wearing the bar cross same as ever. The brand never transferred. It sits now in Wade Halloran's name, filed clean at the courthouse by young Ferris the clerk, who I think was a little proud to be part of it, in his ink-stained way. Garrett is gone. He rode for the railroad towns before the snow, when it was plain there was nothing left to hold. Last I heard he mends fence for a man out east of here, on wages, which is a thing to think on, A man who owned 11,000 acres now stringing another man's wire for another man's pay. I do not gloat on it. I am too old, and I have wrapped too many of the newly born to take much joy in any man brought low. But I will say, the fit of it is right. He kept what he did not use, and burned what he could not sell. And now he is the one being used, and it is nobody's doing but his own. Slode was let go. Quiet. No charge was pressed. Wade would not have it, and I would not have it, and truth to tell, the pressing of it would only have dragged Delia's name and Marisol's name through the county for no gain to the living. He drifted off west somewhere. An old man with an old secret, carrying it now alone, which is its own sentence and heavier than any a court would hand down. And this spring, past the breaks where the grass comes green, I caught another child. Wade married a girl from over near the county line, a steady girl with a laugh in her, and she came to her time in the front room of the ranch house, in the very house I'd been thrown out of, with me at the foot of the bed where I have been at the foot of 400 beds. And I caught their firstborn the way I caught Wade himself, and his father before him, and I checked the little hand the way I always do. There was no thumb to speak of yet, they come into it later, but the shape was there if you knew to look, and I knew to look. I wrapped that baby in a fresh indigo shawl I'd dyed and stitched over the winter, a new one, a third one, with the bar cross worked into the corner in white thread. And I laid Ephraim's great-grandchild in Ephraim's true son's arms in Ephraim's own house, and I thought, well, there, it's mended. It took a year and a fire and a hard walk to a courthouse, but it's mended. The coffee is steaming on the porch rail as I tell you this. First light is coming up gray and gold over the pens. There's a boy I can hear whistling out by the barn, one of the new hands Wade took on, and the smell of the range comes in the window the way it has every morning of my life on this ground. I will leave you with the one thing I have learned, and it is not much, but it is true, and I have paid for it. The land forgets no one who bled for it, and neither in the end does it forget who only took. Ephraim knew that. He put it in a paper and hid the paper where the taker couldn't reach, and he set an old woman's name in the law. And he trusted that the truth would keep till the true blood needed it. It kept. I kept it. That is the whole of my life's work, if you want to know it, whether it was a child I caught or a truth I carried. I kept what was given me to keep, and I gave it back whole when the hour came. So that is the story of the Roundup, where an old granny woman told it, and was believed, and the brand came home. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of it, I thank you. And I'd take it kind if you'd comment the town you're watching from, so I can see how far across this country an old woman's word has finally, at last, been let to travel.